There is a place in Tennessee where the very air seems to remember. Drive northwest from Nashville, past the rolling hills and the winding Red River, and you will find yourself in the small town of Adams, population 624. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where the pace of life moves slow, and where the past is not something buried in history books, but something that walks alongside you. Here, in this quiet corner of Robertson County, something happened 2 centuries ago that would become woven into the fabric of American folklore so deeply that it has never been forgotten. This is the home of the Bell Witch, and her story is unlike any other in the annals of the supernatural. Most ghost stories, when you strip away the embellishments and the theatrical retellings, are whispers. They are shadows glimpsed from the corner of an eye, cold spots in empty rooms, the feeling of being watched when no one is there. They are personal, intimate terrors that belong to the individuals who experience them and dissolve when exposed to the harsh light of scrutiny. But the Bell Witch was different. She did not hide in ambiguity. She did not rely on the uncertainty of perception or the tricks of memory. She announced herself. She conversed. She performed. And she did so before an audience of hundreds, leaving behind not just frightened whispers, but a trail of documented testimony that scholars and skeptics alike have struggled to explain for 200 years. What happened on the Bell Farm between 1817 and 1821 was witnessed by neighbors, by ministers, by doctors, by the curious and the skeptical alike. They came from miles around, drawn by reports of an invisible entity that could speak with perfect clarity, that could quote scripture and curse with equal facility, that could predict the future and recount events happening miles away at that very moment. An entity that claimed to be a witch, that tormented a respected farmer and his family, and that ultimately, according to every account, succeeded in killing a man. Tennessee stands alone in this dark distinction. It is the only state in the Union where an official death has been attributed to supernatural causes, and that death belongs to John Bell. The story of the Bell Witch is not simply a tale of things that go bump in the night. It is a story about a family caught in something they could not understand, could not escape, and could not explain. It is a story about a community that watched and wondered and argued over what was happening before their eyes. It is a story that raises questions that remain unanswered to this day. Was it a genuine supernatural entity, a spirit of the dead returned with malicious intent? Was it an elaborate hoax perpetrated by someone with everything to gain? Was it a manifestation of psychological trauma, of repressed emotions given form through some mechanism we still do not fully understand? Or was it something else entirely, something that defies categorization, something that belongs to that uncertain territory between belief and disbelief, where the most unsettling stories make their home? The legend has grown over the decades, accreting layers of embellishment and interpretation, spawning books and films and endless speculation. But beneath all of that, beneath the tourist attractions and the Halloween hayrides, there is a core of documented testimony that cannot be easily dismissed. There are letters, there are newspaper accounts, there are the sworn statements of witnesses who had nothing to gain and much to lose by associating themselves with such a strange and troubling affair. And there is the land itself, the cave, the farmland along the Red River where the Bell family built their lives and where something, whether born of this world or another, came to tear those lives apart. To understand the Bell Witch, we must begin not with the supernatural, but with the mundane. We must begin with a family, with a piece of land, with the ordinary rhythms of frontier life in the early American Republic. We must begin with John Bell, a man who wanted nothing more than to provide for his family and live in peace, and who instead became the central figure in what many consider to be the greatest ghost story America has ever produced. In the year 1804, the state of Tennessee was still young, still raw, still very much a frontier. The great westward expansion was underway, and families from the crowded eastern states were streaming across the mountains in search of land and opportunity. Among them was John Bell, a prosperous farmer from Halifax County, North Carolina, a man of 54 years with a wife, a growing family, and the ambition to build something lasting in this new territory. John Bell was, by all accounts, a man of substance and respectability. He was not fleeing scandal or debt. He was not running from the law or escaping a troubled past. He was simply doing what thousands of Americans were doing in that era, seeking better land and greater prospects. He purchased 320 acres of fertile farmland along the banks of the Red River in what would become Robertson County. Land that was rich and dark and perfect for cultivation. He brought with him his wife, Lucy Williams Bell, a woman described in all accounts as gentle, pious, and devoted, and their children. Over the years, the Bell family would grow to include 9 children in total, 3 more born after their arrival in Tennessee. The Bells were not isolated pioneers, carving out a homestead in the wilderness. They settled in an area that was already developing a sense of community. There were other farms, other families, churches being built, schools being established. John Bell was not just a farmer, but a man of standing in this nascent community. He was a devout Baptist, and he served as an elder at the Red River Baptist Church. He was known to be honest in his dealings, generous with his neighbors, a man who kept his word and expected others to do the same. The family prospered. The farm produced abundant crops. The children grew. For 13 years, life on the Bell farm was exactly what John Bell had hoped it would be: ordinary, peaceful, productive. The farmhouse itself was a substantial structure by the standards of the time. Built of hewn logs and located in a clearing surrounded by fields and forest. There was a barn for the livestock, a smokehouse for preserving meat, all the outbuildings necessary for a working farm. The Red River provided water for the crops and the animals. The surrounding woods provided timber and game. It was a good life, the kind of life that countless American families were building in those years. A life rooted in hard work and faith, and the belief that the future held nothing but promise. The Bell children ranged in age from young adults to small children. The oldest sons were already helping with the heavy work of the farm. The daughters were learning the skills they would need to manage households of their own someday. And then there was Betsy, Elizabeth Bell. Born in 1806, the youngest daughter, a girl who would become central to everything that followed. In 1817, when the strangeness began, Betsy was just 11 years old, on the cusp of adolescence, a child in a household that was about to be torn apart by forces no one could have anticipated. The Bells were not the only people living on the property. Like many prosperous farmers of that era and place, they owned slaves. The historical record is not extensive on this point, but the accounts that do exist mention several enslaved people working on the Bell farm. One of them, a man named Dean, would later report his own encounters with the strange phenomena. This is a detail that cannot be ignored when we speak of this story. The Bell family's prosperity was built, at least in part, on the labor of people they held in bondage. This was the reality of the antebellum South, and the Bell family, for all their respectability and piety, were participants in that system. In the summer of 1817, 13 years after the family's arrival, John Bell was a man of 61. He had achieved everything he had set out to achieve. His farm was successful. His family was healthy. His position in the community was secure. He had every reason to believe that the remaining years of his life would continue in the same peaceful pattern. He had no reason to believe that within 3 years he would be dead, his health destroyed, his family traumatized, and his name forever linked with one of the most bizarre and unsettling episodes in American history. But the strangeness was coming. It was already on the farm, in fact, though no one yet understood what it meant. Strange animals had been seen in the fields and woods. Odd sounds had been heard in the night. Small disturbances that could be explained away, rationalized, dismissed as nothing important. The land along the Red River had been home to other people long before John Bell arrived. Native American burial mounds dotted the landscape. Old graves, old bones, old stories about things that had happened in this place before any European had set foot here. The frontier was not empty land waiting to be claimed. It was land with its own history, its own memories, and perhaps, if the stories are to be believed, its own spirits. What happened next would transform the Bell farm from a place of ordinary domestic life into a site of pilgrimage for the curious, the faithful, and the skeptical. It would bring hundreds of visitors to the family's door. It would fracture the peace that John Bell had worked 13 years to build, and it would begin, as so many strange things do, with something small, something easy to dismiss, something that seemed, at first, to be nothing at all. It was a summer evening in 1817. The light was fading, that golden hour when the heat of the day begins to release its grip and the shadows grow long. John Bell was walking through his cornfield, doing what farmers do, checking on his crops, looking for signs of pests or disease, estimating the yield. The corn was high, the stalks rustled in the breeze, and then, between the rows, John Bell saw something that stopped him in his tracks. At first, he thought it was a dog. It had the body of a dog, roughly the right size and shape, but as he looked closer, as his eyes tried to make sense of what they were seeing in the dimming light, he realized that the head was wrong. The head was not a dog's head. It was the head of a rabbit, with long ears standing upright. The creature stared at him. John Bell, a practical man, a man who had spent his life dealing with the natural world, did not waste time wondering what kind of animal this might be. He raised his rifle and fired. The shot should have dropped the creature where it stood. John Bell was a good shot. The distance was close, but the animal did not fall. Instead, it simply vanished. Not ran away, not darted into the corn, vanished. One moment it was there, solid and real, and the next moment it was gone, as if it had never existed at all. John Bell stood in the cornfield, the smell of gunpowder hanging in the air, and stared at the empty space where the creature had been. He was not a superstitious man. He did not believe in ghosts or demons or any of the supernatural nonsense that some people filled their heads with. There had to be a rational explanation. Perhaps it had been a trick of the light. Perhaps the shadows and the fading sun had confused his eyes. He went back to the house and said nothing about it. But that same night, the sounds began. It started with knocking. A rhythmic, deliberate rapping on the outer walls of the house, moving around the perimeter as if something was circling the building. The family woke and listened. John Bell went outside with a lantern, expecting to find an animal, perhaps a raccoon or an opossum, but there was nothing. Just the empty darkness and the sound of the night insects. When he went back inside, the knocking continued for a few minutes more and then stopped. The next night, it happened again, and the night after that. But now the sounds were changing, evolving. They were no longer just knocking. There were scratching sounds, as if claws were being dragged across wood. There were gnawing sounds, as if rats were chewing on the bedposts, though when lamps were lit and inspections made, there were no rats and no marks. The sounds moved through the house, from room to room, always just out of sight, always ceasing when someone went to investigate. John Bell, determined to maintain his reputation as a rational man, continued to insist that there was a natural explanation. Perhaps there were animals in the walls. Perhaps there was something wrong with the structure of the house causing the wood to settle and make these noises. He told his family not to speak of it outside the home. This was a private matter, something that would be resolved in time, and there was no need to invite gossip or speculation from the neighbors. But the phenomena continued to escalate. The children began to report that their bedclothes were being pulled off in the night. They would wake suddenly, cold and exposed, their blankets and sheets lying in heaps on the floor. They described feeling their pillows being tugged from beneath their heads. Youngest daughter Betsy, sleeping in the room she shared with her sisters, woke one night, screaming that something was pulling her hair. When her parents rushed in with a lamp, Betsy's hair was indeed disheveled, tangled, as if someone had been yanking on it, but there was no one else in the room. The enslaved man, Dean, reported his own experience. He told of walking at night to visit his wife, who lived on a neighboring property, and seeing the same strange dog, rabbit creature following him along the dark road. When he turned to confront it, it would disappear. When he continued walking, it would reappear behind him. Other family members reported seeing strange birds of enormous size perched on fence posts, birds that would fly away with a sound like thunder when approached. Betsy claimed to have seen a young girl in a green dress hanging from a tree branch in the woods near the house, though when she brought others to show them, there was nothing there. For weeks, John Bell maintained his silence about the increasingly disturbing events. But the strain was beginning to show. The family was not sleeping well. The children were frightened. Lucy Bell, always a strong woman, was starting to show signs of exhaustion and worry. And the sounds, the disturbances, were now happening every single night without fail. Whatever this was, it was not going away. It was not resolving itself naturally. It was, in fact, getting worse. Finally, John Bell made a decision that would change everything. He would tell someone outside the family. He would bring in a witness, someone whose judgment he trusted, someone who might be able to help make sense of what was happening. The man he chose was James Johnston, a close friend and neighbor, a man of good sense and strong faith. Johnston agreed to spend a night at the Bell home and observe the phenomena for himself. James Johnston arrived skeptical. He had known John Bell for years and believed him to be an honest man, but he also believed that there were logical explanations for most things that seemed mysterious. Perhaps the children were playing pranks. Perhaps John and Lucy were simply overtired and imagining things that were not really there. He settled into the house, prepared to spend an uneventful night, and then gently suggest that the Bells were worrying over nothing. He was wrong. That night, Johnston experienced everything the family had described. He heard the knocking, the scratching, the sounds of invisible rats gnawing wood. He felt his own bed covers pulled away. He heard what sounded like chains being dragged across the floor of the hallway. And when he lit a candle and went to investigate, he saw nothing that could account for any of it. By morning, James Johnston was no longer skeptical. He sat with John Bell at the breakfast table and delivered his assessment. What was happening in this house was not natural. It was not the product of overactive imaginations or childish pranks. It was, in Johnston's opinion, the work of an evil spirit, the kind mentioned in the Bible, the kind that required spiritual intervention. John Bell, hearing his friend's words, felt something inside him break. The facade of normalcy, the insistence on rational explanations, could no longer hold. Something was in his house. Something invisible and malicious. Something that seemed determined to disrupt his family's peace. And now, with Johnston as a witness, he could no longer keep it secret. Word would spread. The community would hear about it. And the Bell family's ordeal was about to become very, very public. James Johnston's advice to John Bell was straightforward. They could not fight this alone. They needed help, and they needed witnesses. Johnston suggested that Bell invite others from the community to come to the house, to observe the phenomena, and perhaps, through prayer and collective faith, to drive out whatever malevolent force had taken up residence there. Bell, reluctant but desperate, agreed. The visitors began to arrive. Neighbors at first, people who knew the Bell family and were concerned for their welfare. They came with skepticism, but that skepticism rarely survived a single night in the Bell home. The phenomena performed reliably, almost as if it enjoyed having an audience. The sounds would start, the bedclothes would be pulled away, objects would move, and occasionally, items would be thrown across rooms by invisible hands. The witnesses would return to their own homes shaken and uncertain, but convinced that something genuinely strange was happening on the Bell farm. Then the sounds changed again. They began to include a voice. At first, it was barely audible, a faint whistling sound that seemed to have no source. Then it became a weak, raspy whisper, like the voice of an old woman. The words were not clear. They seemed to be fragments, syllables without meaning. But over the course of days and weeks, the voice grew stronger. The entity, whatever it was, was learning to speak, and once it could speak, it would not stop. The voice became clear and distinct, unmistakably female, with an old woman's rough tone. It would quote scripture, reciting long passages from the Bible with perfect accuracy. It would sing hymns. It would curse and swear with a vocabulary that shocked the pious visitors who heard it. It would engage in conversation, answering questions, offering opinions, making jokes. It demonstrated knowledge that seemed impossible for any living person to possess. It would recount sermons that had been preached that very morning in churches 13 miles away, repeating them word for word. It would describe events happening in distant locations in real time. It seemed to be able to be in multiple places at once, or to have access to information that no human could have. When asked who or what it was, the entity gave multiple answers. Sometimes it claimed to be a spirit that had been buried in the woods nearby, disturbed from its grave, searching for a lost tooth. Sometimes it claimed to be a spirit from everywhere, from heaven and hell and the earth, created millions of years ago. And sometimes, when pressed, it would say that it was the witch of Kate Batts. This last answer was the one that stuck. The entity became known as Kate, and the haunting became known as the Bell Witch. Kate Batts was a real person, a neighbor of the Bells, a widow who had a reputation for being difficult and temperamental. She had been involved in some kind of dispute with John Bell, the details of which varied depending on who was telling the story. Some accounts said it was a land deal, some said it was the sale of a slave. The entity's claim to be associated with Kate Batts seemed to provide an explanation, a motive for the haunting. Kate Batts had cursed the Bell family, and now her witch, her spiritual agent, was carrying out that curse. But there were problems with this explanation, even from the beginning. Kate Batts was still alive. She had not died and returned as a vengeful spirit. She lived nearby and continued to go about her business, and while she was aware of the accusations, she neither confirmed nor denied them. Later research would show that while there had indeed been a dispute involving the Bells and a member of the Batts family, it was not Kate herself, but her brother-in-law, Benjamin Batts, who had been involved. And Kate Batts would outlive John Bell by many years, dying peacefully long after the haunting had ended. So if the witch was not actually the spirit of Kate Batts, then what was it? And why had it chosen to identify itself that way? The witch seemed to have a complex personality, or perhaps multiple personalities. Sometimes it was playful, engaging in banter with visitors, telling jokes, demonstrating what could almost be called a sense of humor. Sometimes it was vicious, hurling insults and profanity. It seemed to have favorites among the Bell family. It spoke kindly of Lucy Bell, calling her the most perfect woman living, and it never harmed her. It largely ignored the older Bell children, but it had two specific targets upon which it focused all of its malice. Those targets were John Bell himself and his youngest daughter, Betsy. The witch made its intentions clear. It stated openly that it intended to kill John Bell. It called him Old Jack and cursed him constantly, predicting his death, promising that it would torment him until his last breath. And it seemed to have a particular obsession with preventing Betsy Bell from marrying a young man named Joshua Gardner. Joshua was a neighbor boy, a good match for Betsy by all conventional standards, and the two young people had formed an attachment. But the witch opposed the relationship with a fury that seemed disproportionate. It would attack Betsy whenever Joshua was mentioned, slapping her, pulling her hair, leaving marks on her skin. It would scream and curse when Joshua visited the house, making his presence so uncomfortable that eventually he stopped coming. The attacks on Betsy were, by all accounts, genuinely violent. Witnesses reported seeing her slapped by invisible hands, seeing red marks appear on her face and arms as if she had been struck. They described hearing her scream in pain as she was pinched and scratched. Sometimes she would be thrown across rooms. Sometimes she would collapse unconscious. The witch seemed to take particular pleasure in tormenting this young girl, and no one could stop it. Prayers did not stop it. Pleading did not stop it. There was nothing her family could do but watch and endure. The community's response to all of this was divided. Some people believed they were witnessing genuine supernatural phenomena. Others suspected trickery or hoax. Some thought the family was suffering from mass hysteria or some form of shared delusion. The local church community was particularly troubled. Ministers came to the Bell home to perform exorcisms, to pray for deliverance, to confront the entity with the power of God. None of it worked. The witch would mock them, quote scripture back at them, and continue its activities unabated. In 1818, John Bell was formally excommunicated from his church. The official reason given was a charge of usury related to a slave sale, but many believed the real reason was the ongoing haunting. The church leadership did not know what to make of what was happening at the Bell farm, but they wanted distance from it. They wanted to make it clear that whatever this was, the church was not associated with it. For John Bell, a devout man who had served as an elder, this excommunication was a devastating blow. He was being ostracized by his own faith community at the very moment when he most needed their support. The witch had succeeded in isolating the Bell family. Their reputation in the community was damaged. Some neighbors avoided them, fearing contamination by whatever evil had attached itself to them. Others came only out of morbid curiosity, to see the show, to hear the witch speak. The Bell home had become a public spectacle, with people camping on the property, waiting for nightfall and the return of the phenomena. And through it all, the witch continued to speak, continued to perform, continued to torment. It had a voice now, and it had an audience, and it seemed to have no intention of leaving. For young Betsy Bell, the years between 1817 and 1821 were a waking nightmare. She was 11 years old when the haunting began. By the time it ended, she was 15, and the childhood that should have been hers was gone, stolen by an invisible tormentor that seemed to focus on her with an intensity that no one could explain. The physical attacks were constant and unpredictable. Betsy would be sitting with her family, going about normal domestic activities, when suddenly she would cry out in pain. Red welts would appear on her arms and face, as if invisible fingers had pinched her. Her hair would be yanked, sometimes so violently that clumps of it were pulled out. She would be slapped, the sound of the impact clearly audible to everyone in the room, the mark of a handprint appearing on her cheek. Sometimes she would be lifted and thrown, her body hurled across the room to crash into walls or furniture. The attacks often happened in her sleep. She would wake screaming, clutching her head, saying that the witch was pulling her hair. Her sisters, sleeping in the same room, would watch helplessly as Betsy writhed and struggled against something they could not see. Sometimes, the attacks would leave her unconscious. She would collapse, and the family would have to carry her to bed and wait for her to revive. When she woke, she would have no memory of what had happened, only the pain and the marks on her body. The witch's opposition to her relationship with Joshua Gardner was absolute and unyielding. Whenever Joshua came to visit, the phenomena would escalate dramatically. The witch would scream curses, would throw objects, would attack Betsy with such violence that Joshua could only stand by, horrified and helpless. He was a young man, probably not yet 20, and he was facing something completely outside his experience or understanding. He loved Betsy. He wanted to marry her. But the witch made it clear that, as long as they continued their relationship, the torment would continue. Friends and neighbors who witnessed the attacks tried to protect Betsy, but there was nothing they could do. You cannot fight an enemy you cannot see. You cannot stop a hand that has no physical form. People would surround Betsy, would try to shield her with their own bodies, but the attacks would happen anyway. The witch seemed to be able to reach through any defense, to strike at Betsy no matter who was trying to protect her. The psychological toll on Betsy was enormous. She was living in constant fear, never knowing when the next attack would come. She could not sleep peacefully. She could not leave her home without anxiety. Her childhood was consumed by terror and pain. And beyond the physical attacks, there was the knowledge that this thing, this entity, was obsessed with her. was watching her always, was determined to control her life and her choices. The witch did not simply want to hurt her. It wanted to break her will, to force her to abandon the boy she loved, to submit to its demands. John Bell's suffering was different, but no less terrible. The witch had declared its intention to kill him, and it pursued that goal with methodical cruelty. The attacks on John Bell were less physically violent than those on Betsy, but they were constant and debilitating. He began to experience strange facial twitching, spasms of the muscles that he could not control. His jaw would lock, his tongue would swell. He had difficulty swallowing, struggling to eat and drink. He developed what seemed to be seizures, episodes where he would lose control of his body, thrashing and convulsing. The witch would mock him constantly, calling him Old Jack, cursing him, promising his death. It seemed to take pleasure in describing the various ways he would die, in predicting that his end was near. And John Bell, a man who had been robust and healthy just a few years earlier, began to decline visibly. His health deteriorated. He lost weight. He grew weak. He spent increasing amounts of time in bed, unable to work the farm that had been his life's work. The psychological impact on John Bell was perhaps even worse than the physical symptoms. He was the head of his household, the protector of his family, and he was completely powerless to stop what was happening. He could not protect his daughter. He could not rid his home of this intruder. He watched his family being torn apart, watched his reputation in the community being destroyed, and there was nothing he could do. The man who had built a life of respectability and success was being systematically broken down, and the entire community was watching it happen. The witch seemed to have an intimate knowledge of John Bell's movements and activities. It would know where he had been, what he had said, who he had spoken to. It was as if he were under constant surveillance, with no privacy, no escape. Even when he left the house, even when he thought he was alone, the witch's influence seemed to follow him. It would recount his conversations to others. It would mock him for things he had done when no one else was present. This omniscience, this inability to escape the entity's gaze, added another layer of torment to his already unbearable situation. The relationship between John Bell's illness and the witch's activities is one of the most disturbing aspects of the entire story. As the witch's attacks intensified, John Bell's health declined in direct proportion. When the witch was particularly active and vicious, his symptoms would worsen. On nights when the phenomena were violent, he would wake the next morning more debilitated than before. It was as if the entity was literally draining his life force, feeding on his vitality, killing him slowly. And through all of this, the Bell family had to maintain some semblance of normal life. The farm still needed to be worked. The children still needed to be fed and clothed. Lucy Bell, strong as she was, bore the burden of keeping the household functioning while her husband declined and her daughter suffered. She had her own grief, her own fear, but she could not afford to give in to it. Someone had to hold the family together, and that responsibility fell to her. The older Bell sons took over more of the farm work as their father became unable to manage it. They tried to protect their younger sister, tried to support their parents, tried to maintain their own equilibrium in a situation that seemed to have no resolution. John Bell Jr., one of the older sons, kept detailed notes of what was happening, documenting the events as they unfolded. His account, later titled Our Family Trouble, would become one of the primary sources for understanding what happened during those terrible years. By 1820, John Bell's condition had deteriorated to the point where he was largely bedridden. He was 65 years old, worn down by 3 years of relentless torment. His face was gaunt, his body was weak, and the witch continued to promise, night after night, that his death was imminent. Old Jack's time was coming, it would say. Soon he would be gone, and then, perhaps, the witch's work would be done. The family waited, watching John Bell fade, knowing that the end was approaching but powerless to prevent it. The thing that had invaded their home 3 years earlier had made a promise, and it was keeping that promise with terrible efficiency. Word of the haunting at the Bell Farm spread through Robertson County and beyond, with remarkable speed. In the early 19th century, news traveled by word of mouth, through letters, through travelers stopping at inns and sharing stories heard along the road. And the Bell Witch, with her ability to speak and her willingness to perform for audiences, was a story that demanded to be told. People came from miles around, sometimes traveling for days, to witness the phenomena for themselves. They would arrive at the Bell Farm and ask permission to stay the night, to hear the witch speak, to observe whatever strange events might occur. John Bell, despite his deteriorating health and his family's suffering, rarely turned anyone away. Perhaps he hoped that among these visitors might be someone with knowledge or wisdom that could help end the torment. Perhaps he simply felt that there was no point in trying to keep it secret anymore. The community knew. The entire region knew. The Bell Witch was no longer a private family trouble. It was a public phenomenon. The visitors came from all walks of life. There were curious neighbors, of course, but also travelers from distant towns. There were ministers and doctors, people with education and standing who thought they might be able to explain or cure what was happening. There were self-proclaimed experts in the supernatural, witch layers as they were called. Men who claimed to have special knowledge of spirits and the power to drive them away. There were skeptics who came determined to expose what they were certain must be a hoax. And there were simple believers, people who accepted the reality of spirits and demons and who came to pray for the family's deliverance. The witch seemed to enjoy the attention. When the house was full of visitors, the phenomena would intensify. The voice would be louder, more talkative, more willing to engage in conversation. Visitors could ask it questions, and it would answer, though its answers were often cryptic or mocking. It would demonstrate its knowledge by describing events happening elsewhere, by recounting conversations it should have had no way of overhearing, by singing songs and quoting texts with perfect accuracy. One of the witch's most impressive demonstrations involved church sermons. On Sunday mornings, when most of the community was attending services, the witch would remain at the Bell home with anyone who had stayed behind. And when the churchgoers returned, the witch would recount, word for word, the sermons that had been preached that morning. Not just from one church, but from multiple churches miles apart. It would describe the preacher's gestures, the hymns that had been sung, the reactions of the congregations. Witnesses who had attended those services confirmed that the witch's accounts were accurate in every detail. How could an invisible entity be present at multiple locations simultaneously? How could it possess such detailed knowledge? These were questions that no one could answer. The phenomenon of multiple ministers visiting to perform exorcisms or spiritual interventions became almost routine. Presbyterian ministers, Methodist ministers, Baptist ministers, all came with their Bibles and their faith, certain that the power of prayer would drive out the evil spirit. The witch would listen politely to their prayers and then, when they finished, would mock them. It would point out theological errors in their sermons. It would quote scripture back at them, often obscure passages that the ministers themselves had difficulty placing. It seemed to have an encyclopedic knowledge of the Bible, which made the encounter all the more unsettling. This was not an ignorant demon. This was something with intelligence, with education, with a kind of twisted scholarship. Some visitors reported physical encounters with the entity. They described feeling invisible hands touching them, pushing them, even striking them. Objects would be moved in their presence. Blankets would be pulled from their beds. Some claimed to have seen apparitions, brief glimpses of shadowy forms or strange lights. But the most consistent and disturbing feature was always the voice, that clear, unmistakable voice of an old woman that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, that could whisper in your ear or shout across a room, that never tired and never stopped. The community's religious leadership struggled with how to respond. The Red River Baptist Church had already excommunicated John Bell, distancing themselves from the whole affair. But other churches and their ministers were divided. Some saw the Bell Witch as evidence of demonic activity, proof that the spiritual warfare described in the Bible was real and ongoing. Others suspected fraud, believing that someone in the Bell household was perpetrating an elaborate deception. Still others proposed natural explanations, suggesting that the phenomena might be the result of unusual atmospheric conditions, underground gases, or some form of mass hysteria affecting everyone who visited the house. The skeptics who came looking to expose a hoax generally left confused and uncertain. They would arrive with theories about hidden speakers, accomplices, ventriloquism, all the standard explanations for supposed supernatural phenomena. But the witch would perform in ways that defeated these explanations. It would speak when every member of the household was accounted for and visible. It would demonstrate knowledge that no one present could have possessed. It would appear in multiple locations, speaking to people in different parts of the property simultaneously. The skeptics would leave not necessarily believing in ghosts, but unable to provide a satisfactory natural explanation for what they had witnessed. Among the many visitors to the Bell farm, one story stands out above all others, though its historical accuracy remains a subject of debate. This is the story of Andrew Jackson's visit. In 1819 or 1820, Andrew Jackson was not yet president, but was already a national hero, famous for his military victories and his larger-than-life personality. According to accounts that emerged decades later, Jackson, who owned property in the area and had heard of the Bell Witch phenomenon, decided to visit the farm with a group of companions to investigate for himself. The story, as it has been passed down, describes Jackson's party traveling by wagon along the road toward the Bell property. As they approached, the wagon suddenly stopped. The horses strained and pulled, but the wheels would not turn. The men got out and examined the wagon, searching for a mechanical problem, but could find nothing wrong. And then they heard it, the witch's voice, laughing and introducing herself, telling them that they could proceed now, that she would see them again later. That evening, according to the tale, Jackson and his men were at the Bell house when a member of the party who claimed to be a professional witch layer announced that he would confront the spirit. The man had a silver bullet and special rituals that he was certain would drive away any ghost. The witch appeared immediately, mocking him, calling him a fraud, and then allegedly producing phenomena that terrorized the man so thoroughly that he fled the house in panic. Jackson, impressed and entertained, supposedly said something to the effect of preferring to fight the British at New Orleans than deal with the Bell Witch. The next morning, he and his party departed, their curiosity satisfied. This story is dramatic and has become one of the most famous elements of the Bell Witch legend. However, historians have found complications with this account. The story first appeared in written form in Martin Van Buren Ingram's 1894 book, based on a letter from a man named Thomas Yancey, who claimed his grandfather had witnessed Jackson's visit. But nowhere in Jackson's own extensive correspondence, journals, or documented movements during the years in question is there any mention of a visit to the Bell farm. Skeptical researchers point out that during Jackson's contentious 1824 presidential campaign, his political enemies would likely have exploited any association with witchcraft or the supernatural, yet no such attacks appeared. The story may be based on oral tradition that was genuine but undocumented. Or it may be a legend that grew up around the larger legend, attaching Jackson's famous name to add credibility to an already extraordinary tale. What we can say is that while the visit has become part of the standard Bell Witch narrative, it cannot be confirmed through contemporary historical documentation. The constant stream of visitors, while providing witnesses to the phenomena, also added to the Bell family's burden. Their home was no longer their own. Privacy was impossible. Strangers camped on their property, trampled through their fields, filled their house night after night. The family's suffering had become public entertainment, a spectacle that people traveled to see. And through it all, the witch continued to speak, continued to perform, and continued to promise that John Bell's death was coming soon. By the autumn of 1820, that promise was about to be fulfilled. December of 1820 was cold. Winter had settled over Tennessee, and on the Bell farm the atmosphere was heavy with foreboding. John Bell had been confined to bed for weeks, his condition steadily worsening. The strange symptoms that had plagued him for 3 years, the facial spasms, the difficulty swallowing, the seizures, had progressed to the point where he was barely conscious much of the time. The family kept vigil at his bedside, watching him fade, knowing that the end was near. The witch's behavior during this time became almost solicitous in a grotesque way. It would ask about John Bell's condition. It would predict, with chilling accuracy, the timing of his fits and seizures, and it continued to promise that his death was imminent, that its work was almost done. There was a sense of anticipation in the entity's voice, as if it were waiting for something, as if everything that had happened over the past 3 years had been leading to this moment. On the morning of December 19th, 1820, the family found John Bell in his bed, deeply unconscious and unresponsive. He had slipped into what appeared to be a coma during the night. His breathing was shallow, his skin was cold. Lucy Bell and the children gathered around him, knowing that these were likely his final hours. They sent for neighbors, for friends, for anyone who should be present for the passing of a man who, despite everything, had been a respected member of the community. John Bell Jr. went to retrieve his father's usual medicine. According to the accounts, he discovered that the familiar medicine bottles were gone, and in their place was a small vial containing an unknown dark, smoky liquid. John Bell Jr. picked up the vial, examined it, showed it to others in the room. No one recognized it. No one knew where it had come from. And then the witch's voice filled the room. The entity spoke clearly and without any of its usual mockery. According to the accounts passed down through the family, it said something to the effect of having given old Jack a dose from that vial the night before, and that this had fixed him. The voice was triumphant, satisfied, final. The witch appeared to be confessing. It had poisoned John Bell. Whatever was in that vial had been administered to him, and now he lay dying. The family, horrified and uncertain what to do, decided to test the contents of the vial. According to the story, when they gave a drop of the mysterious liquid to a cat, the animal reacted immediately, convulsing, and within moments, it was dead. The vial appeared to contain a powerful poison, something that killed swiftly and violently. When the vial was thrown into the fireplace, the liquid reportedly produced a bright blue flame, a detail that modern researchers have noted is consistent with arsenic, though this remains speculative since the actual contents were never scientifically analyzed. John Bell never regained consciousness. He died on December 20th, 1820, at the age of approximately 70, surrounded by his family. The cause of death was listed in records as unknown illness or simply death, though the family and community believed the witch's confession. Whether John Bell was actually poisoned with a substance from the vial, whether he died from the cumulative effects of his long illness, or whether the vial was part of the legend added later, we cannot definitively determine from this historical distance. What is certain is that John Bell died, and the Bell Witch took credit for his death, a claim that has echoed through 2 centuries. The funeral was held on the 21st of December. The community turned out in large numbers. Whether out of respect for the family or morbid curiosity is impossible to say. John Bell was buried in the family cemetery on the property, a simple grave that can still be visited today. The funeral should have been a solemn, dignified affair, a time for the family to grieve and for the community to pay their respects. But according to the accounts, the witch had other plans. As the mourners gathered and the service progressed, the witch's voice reportedly rang out across the cemetery. It was singing, loud, joyful, mocking songs, including what some accounts describe as drinking songs. The entity appeared to be celebrating John Bell's death. The mourners stood in stunned silence, unsure whether to continue with the service or leave. Some people did depart, unable to tolerate the spectacle. Others stayed, determined to see John Bell properly laid to rest, despite the invisible tormentor's disruptions. The witch's behavior at the funeral was perhaps its most openly malevolent display. It had achieved its stated goal. John Bell was dead, and it wanted everyone to know that it had succeeded in its purpose. The haunting, which had always been disturbing, now had resulted in a death. The line between spiritual mischief and genuine harm had been decisively crossed. After the funeral, after John Bell was in the ground, the phenomena at the Bell farm began to change. The witch's attention shifted more fully to Betsy. The attacks on her continued, and the entity's obsession with preventing her marriage to Joshua Gardner became the central focus of its remaining time on the farm. John Bell was gone, but the Bell witch was not finished with the family. Not yet. With John Bell dead and buried, Betsy Bell found herself at the center of the remaining haunting. She was 15 years old, grieving her father, traumatized by years of supernatural torment, and facing a choice that would determine the rest of her life. Joshua Gardner, the young man she loved, still wanted to marry her. But the witch's opposition to the match had not diminished with John Bell's death. If anything, the focus had intensified. The attacks on Betsy when Joshua was near remained severe. She would be struck, thrown, her hair pulled with such violence that witnesses reported fearing for her safety. The witch would scream curses, would predict disaster if the marriage went forward, would make it clear that as long as Betsy pursued a relationship with Joshua, the torment would continue. Joshua himself was never physically attacked, but he had to watch the girl he loved being brutalized by something he could not fight. The psychological toll on both young people was enormous. Joshua Gardner was, by all accounts, a good and decent young man from a neighboring family. He loved Betsy genuinely, but he was also practical enough to recognize an impossible situation when he saw one. How could he marry a girl who would be attacked at any mention of their union? How could he build a life with someone who was being tormented by an invisible entity that seemed to have unlimited power and patience? He was trapped between his love for Betsy and the stark reality that their relationship appeared to bring her nothing but pain. In the spring of 1821, Betsy and Joshua met, and according to the accounts that have come down through the family, Betsy ended the engagement. She told Joshua that she could not marry him, that the witch would never allow it, and that for both their sakes, they had to end their relationship. Joshua, though heartbroken, accepted her decision. The two parted, and though they remained in the same community for the rest of their lives, they never renewed their courtship. Joshua Gardner would eventually marry someone else and live a long life. But that day, a future was closed off, a possibility destroyed by forces neither young person could control or fully understand. The witch's reaction to the broken engagement was immediate and striking. It praised Betsy for making what it called the right choice. The violent attacks on her ceased almost immediately. The entity's tone when speaking to or about Betsy became gentler, even affectionate at times. It was as if the witch had achieved its goal regarding Betsy, and with that achievement, its fury was spent. The girl had submitted to the entity's will. The witch appeared satisfied, but there is another figure in this part of the story, one whose role has become increasingly discussed as researchers have examined the Bell Witch case over the decades. This is Richard Powell, a man who was significantly older than Betsy and who had been a schoolteacher in the community. Powell had known Betsy since she was a child, had likely taught her, and according to the historical record, had developed romantic feelings for her. Richard Powell's presence during the haunting is well documented in the accounts. He was one of the many witnesses who came to the Bell home to observe the phenomena. He spoke with the witch, experienced the disturbances, and was accepted as a trusted friend of the family. Notably, the witch never attacked Powell. It never spoke ill of him. When Powell's name came up, the witch's response was neutral or even positive, a stark contrast to its violent hatred of Joshua Gardner. After Betsy broke off her engagement to Joshua, Richard Powell began courting her more openly. Betsy, who had just experienced years of trauma, the loss of her father, and the painful ending of her first love, accepted his attentions. In 1824, when Betsy was 18 years old and Richard Powell was in his mid to late 30s, they were married. The age difference was substantial, though not unprecedented by the standards of early 19th century rural Tennessee. They would go on to have a long marriage, producing several children, and by all accounts, they lived a stable, if unremarkable, life together. But the circumstances of their marriage have led to persistent questions and speculation among those who study the case. Why did the witch oppose Joshua Gardner so violently, but never speak against Richard Powell? Why did it focus so much energy on breaking up Betsy's relationship with a young man her own age, effectively clearing the way for a much older man to court her? Was the witch acting independently, driven by its own incomprehensible motivations? Or is it possible that someone was manipulating the phenomena, using the cover of the supernatural to achieve very human goals? Some researchers have suggested that Richard Powell himself may have been involved in creating or perpetuating the Bell Witch phenomena. The theory proposes that Powell, desiring Betsy but unable to court her openly while she was too young and while her father was alive, might have used trickery or some form of manipulation to create the haunting. According to this interpretation, John Bell's death would have removed the father who might have objected to such an unsuitable match. The breaking of Betsy's engagement to Joshua would have removed the romantic rival, and Betsy herself, traumatized and vulnerable, would have been more susceptible to Powell's influence and more likely to seek security in an older, stable figure. This theory remains speculative and controversial. There is no direct evidence that Powell was responsible for the phenomena. The sheer number and credibility of witnesses who experienced the haunting, many of whom had no connection to Powell and no reason to participate in a fraud, make a hoax of this scale challenging to accept. How could one man fool so many people for so long? How could he produce phenomena that occurred when he was not present, when he was verifiably elsewhere? The witch's demonstrated ability to be in multiple places simultaneously, to know things Powell could not have known, and to perform physical feats that no simple trickery could easily explain, all present serious obstacles to the fraud theory. On the other hand, Powell certainly benefited from the haunting's outcome. He was educated and intelligent, certainly capable of sophisticated deception if he had chosen to attempt it. He was frequently present at the Bell home throughout the years of activity, and he ultimately married Betsy Bell, achieving what could be seen as the haunting's ultimate result. The suspicious convenience of events, the way they cleared every obstacle to his eventual marriage to Betsy, cannot be completely dismissed, even if we cannot prove his involvement. What we know for certain is limited to the documented facts. After Betsy married Richard Powell, the intense phenomena that had dominated the family's existence for 4 years largely came to an end. There were some lingering minor disturbances for a short time, but nothing comparable to the sustained terror of the earlier years. Betsy Bell Powell would live until 1888, reaching the age of 82. She rarely spoke publicly in detail about her experiences with the witch, though she did confirm in later life that the events had occurred and that she had suffered greatly. Whatever the truth of the haunting, whatever its source, Betsy carried the psychological scars of those years for the rest of her life. The Bell Witch's departure from the Bell Farm in 1821 was not, according to the legend, meant to be permanent. Before the phenomena ceased, the entity reportedly made a promise. It told Lucy Bell and others who were present that it would return in exactly 7 years. This prophecy became part of the lore, and as 1828 approached, the remaining family members waited with some apprehension to see if the witch would keep its word. In 1828, 7 years after John Bell's death, phenomena did return to the property, though on a much smaller and less violent scale than before. The manifestations lasted only a few weeks and were largely confined to sounds and minor disturbances. The witch's voice was heard again, though not as frequently or as loudly. The entity spoke briefly with John Bell Jr., who had remained on the farm and who had kept detailed notes of the original haunting. During these conversations, the witch discussed the past events, talked about the haunting, and spoke of John Bell's death. The tone seemed almost nostalgic, revisiting old grievances without the intense fury that had characterized its earlier presence. During this brief return in 1828, the witch reportedly made another promise. It said that it would return once more, but not in 7 years. Instead, it would come back in 107 years, in 1935, and when it returned, it would visit a descendant of the Bell family. And then, after a few weeks of relatively minor activity, the phenomena ceased entirely. The voice fell silent. The disturbances stopped. The witch was gone again, and this time, the departure seemed more final. The Bell farm gradually returned to what could be called normalcy, though the shadow of what had happened there never fully lifted. The property remained in the Bell family for some years, but eventually it was sold to other owners. New families moved in, worked the land, built their own lives on soil that had witnessed such strange events. Some later residents reported occasional odd occurrences, unexplained sounds, feelings of unease, but nothing remotely comparable to the original haunting. The actual house where the Bell family had lived and suffered no longer exists. It burned down in the late 19th century under circumstances that were not fully documented, but the legend did not die with the house. If anything, the story grew stronger as the years passed. The Bell Witch tale was passed down through generations of Tennessee families, told and retold around fires and at gatherings, embellished and adapted as all oral traditions are. Books began to appear. Articles were published in newspapers. The legend spread beyond Robertson County, beyond Tennessee, becoming part of American folklore, one of the most famous ghost stories in the nation's history. As 1935 approached, people who knew the legend remembered the witch's prophecy about returning in 107 years. Would it come back as promised? According to some accounts, a descendant of the Bell family, a Nashville physician named Dr. Charles Bailey Bell, did report experiencing some unusual phenomena around that time. He claimed to have had conversations with the entity and even published a book in 1934 titled The Bell Witch, a Mysterious Spirit, in which he recounted stories he said were told to him by his great-aunt Betsy in her old age, along with prophecies he claimed the spirit had made. However, the specifics are vague, and nothing occurred in 1935 that matched the intensity or the public nature of the original haunting. If the witch did return, it was a quiet return, nothing like the dramatic events of a century before. There were some reports of minor unusual activity in 1937. The owner of the property at that time mentioned hearing strange noises coming from the cave on the land. Some Bell descendants reported small disturbances, odd sounds, brief glimpses of things they could not explain. But these accounts are anecdotal and impossible to verify. The prophecy, like so many prophetic statements, proved to be either unfulfilled or so ambiguous that no clear manifestation could be confirmed. The cave itself has become central to the modern legend. On the land where the Bell farm once stood, there is a limestone cavern formed by underground water over geological time. During the original haunting, the cave was mentioned in some accounts, though it did not play a major role in the documented events. There were stories of strange sounds emanating from within, of animals refusing to go near it, of an oppressive atmosphere surrounding the entrance. In the 20th century, as interest in the Bell Witch legend grew, and as tourism became economically important to small rural communities, the cave was developed as a tourist attraction. It was named the Bell Witch Cave, and it became a destination for those interested in the paranormal, for curious visitors, for school groups learning about local history. The cave itself is not particularly remarkable from a geological standpoint. A modest limestone formation with passages and chambers, but its association with the legend has made it one of Tennessee's most visited historic sites. Visitors to the Bell Witch Cave report a wide variety of experiences, though these must be evaluated with appropriate skepticism. Some claim to feel a presence, to sense that they are not alone in the darkness. Others report hearing unexplained sounds, whispers, footsteps that have no visible source. Some describe sudden temperature drops or feelings of being touched by invisible hands. Photographs taken in the cave occasionally show anomalies, strange lights or shadows that the photographer insists were not visible to the naked eye. Electronic equipment sometimes malfunctions, cameras fail, recording devices produce strange noises. These reports are subjective and anecdotal, the kind of experiences that are impossible to verify, but that continue to fuel belief in the legend. The land around the cave and the former Bell farm has been investigated by numerous paranormal research groups over the decades. Some claim to have detected unusual electromagnetic fields or recorded what they interpret as electronic voice phenomena. Others conduct investigations and find nothing that cannot be explained by natural causes. The results, as with most paranormal investigations, depend largely on the expectations and interpretations of those conducting them. In the town of Adams, the Bell Witch occupies a complex place in local identity. On one hand, it is a source of local pride, a claim to fame that distinguishes this small community from countless other rural towns. The legend brings tourists, brings attention, brings economic activity to an area that might otherwise be overlooked. On the other hand, it is a story rooted in genuine suffering, in the documented distress of a real family who lived and died in this place. The Bell descendants who still live in the area have varied feelings about how the legend has been commercialized and sensationalized over the years. There is a sense in which the Bell Witch has achieved a kind of cultural immortality that John Bell himself never could have imagined. His grave is visited not because people remember his accomplishments as a farmer or his character as a man, but because he was, according to legend, killed by a supernatural entity. His family's suffering has been transformed into entertainment, into a tourist attraction, into campfire stories. Whether this is simply the inevitable fate of any story that captures the imagination strongly enough, or whether it represents a kind of exploitation of real trauma, is a question each person must answer for themselves. For 200 years, people have been trying to explain the Bell Witch. The range of theories is vast, spanning from the supernatural to the psychological, to the possibility of deliberate fraud. Each explanation has its advocates and its significant challenges, and none has achieved anything close to universal acceptance. The Bell Witch remains, in many fundamental ways, as mysterious and contested today as it was in 1821. The supernatural explanation is perhaps the most straightforward and the one that many people instinctively embrace when they first hear the story. According to this interpretation, the Bell Witch was exactly what it claimed to be: a spirit, a ghost, a supernatural entity with intelligence, personality, and malicious intent toward the Bell family. The evidence cited for this view rests primarily on the testimony of the many witnesses who experienced the phenomena, a significant number of whom were educated, skeptical, and had no apparent motive to fabricate their accounts. The witch demonstrated abilities that seemed to defy natural explanation. It appeared to be in multiple locations simultaneously. It possessed knowledge of events happening miles away at the moment they occurred. It produced physical effects that witnesses observed when all known human participants were accounted for and visible. If we accept even a substantial portion of the reported phenomena as accurately described, then some kind of non-physical intelligence with extraordinary capabilities would appear to have been involved. However, the supernatural explanation, while satisfying to those inclined toward belief, leaves numerous questions unanswered. If the Bell Witch was a spirit, what precisely was its nature? The entity's own claim to be associated with Kate Batts has been thoroughly discredited by historical research. Kate Batts was alive during the haunting and lived for many years after it ended. The dispute that supposedly motivated the curse involved other members of the Batts family, not Kate herself. So if the witch was not the spirit of Kate Batts, as it sometimes claimed, then what was its true identity? Why did it focus its malevolence specifically on John Bell and Betsy Bell? The entity gave contradictory answers to these fundamental questions at different times, claiming variously to be a disturbed spirit from a grave, a being from everywhere, and the witch of Kate Batts. Its own testimony proved unreliable, which raises questions about accepting its supernatural nature simply because it claimed to be supernatural. The psychological explanation proposes that the Bell Witch phenomena were manifestations of hysteria, repressed trauma, or possibly some form of unconscious psychokinetic ability. Researchers who favor this interpretation often point out that poltergeist activity as this type of haunting is commonly classified, frequently centers on adolescent girls going through puberty. Betsy Bell was approximately 11 years old when the phenomena began, precisely the age when such activity is said to most commonly occur. The theory suggests that Betsy herself, without conscious awareness or intent, was somehow generating the phenomena through psychological distress, manifesting as physical effects in the environment around her. This psychological model has certain advantages. It explains why Betsy was so central to the haunting, and why the phenomena largely subsided after she married, and presumably achieved greater emotional stability. It accounts for the timing, beginning during her adolescence and ending in her late teens. However, this explanation struggles with significant aspects of the case. How does unconscious psychokinesis explain the witch's voice, which was heard clearly by hundreds of witnesses and which demonstrated knowledge that Betsy demonstrably did not possess? How does it account for the phenomena that occurred when Betsy was not present, or that specifically targeted her father rather than emanating from her? The psychological explanation, while addressing some features of the case, cannot adequately encompass the full range of reported phenomena. The fraud theory, the possibility that the entire haunting was an elaborate hoax perpetrated by one or more individuals with human motives, remains perhaps the most controversial explanation. As discussed earlier, the primary suspect in fraud scenarios is Richard Powell, who had both motive and opportunity, and who ultimately married Betsy after the haunting conveniently removed all obstacles to their union. Other possibilities that have been suggested include one or more of the Bell children, though no convincing motive has been proposed for why they would subject their family to years of torment and destroy their father's health. A fraud of this magnitude would have required exceptional sophistication. The perpetrator would need to have fooled hundreds of witnesses over 4 years, including skeptics who came specifically to expose trickery. They would need to have produced phenomena that occurred when they themselves were visibly elsewhere. They would need to have maintained perfect consistency in the witch's voice and personality over an extended period. They would need to have had access to information about events happening miles away to create the illusion of omniscience. While ventriloquism, accomplices, and staged effects could potentially account for some of the reported phenomena, creating a hoax that survived this level of scrutiny for this length of time would be remarkable, particularly given the technology and knowledge available in 1817 to 1821. Moreover, if the haunting was a fraud, someone paid an extraordinary price for it. John Bell died. Whether his death was from poison, as the legend claims, from the stress and psychological impact of years of torment, or from an unrelated medical condition that coincidentally occurred during the haunting, he still died. Betsy suffered documented physical and psychological trauma that affected her for the rest of her life. The family's reputation suffered. Their home became a public spectacle. These are heavy costs for a deception, especially when the supposed beneficiary, Richard Powell, could have pursued Betsy through more conventional and less destructive means. What makes the Bell Witch case particularly resistant to definitive explanation is that elements of the story can be found to support multiple interpretations. Those who believe in the supernatural can point to the extraordinary witness testimony and the phenomena that seem to exceed any natural explanation. Those who favor psychological explanations can point to Betsy's age and the poltergeist pattern. Those who suspect fraud can point to Richard Powell's convenient position and the ultimate outcome of the haunting. And those who think the entire story has been exaggerated over time can point to the lack of contemporary documentation and the way the legend grew more elaborate in later retellings. Modern scientific approaches have tried to bring new perspectives to old questions. Dr. Megan Mann, a chemistry professor, has published research suggesting that John Bell's symptoms and death are consistent with arsenic poisoning administered over an extended period. The mysterious blue flame that allegedly shot from the chimney when the vial was thrown into the fire is exactly what arsenic produces when burned. The cat's rapid death from a small dose is consistent with how cats metabolize certain poisons. This research raises the disturbing possibility that John Bell was indeed poisoned, though it cannot tell us who administered the poison or whether the witch's confession was genuine or a cover for human murder. The cultural impact of the Bell Witch legend has been substantial and enduring. The story has been told and retold in countless forms over 2 centuries. Martin Van Buren Ingram's 1894 book, An Authenticated History of the Famous Bell Witch, based on accounts by John Bell Jr. and supplemented with other testimony, was the first full-length treatment of the legend. Ingram's work, while valuable as a compilation of stories and accounts, also added embellishments and dramatizations that have become inseparable from the core narrative. Later authors have produced dozens more books, each offering their own interpretation, emphasis, or fictional elaboration. The Bell Witch has appeared in films, television shows, podcasts, and documentaries. The story has been adapted into horror movies like An American Haunting, historical dramas, and even children's books. Each adaptation changes the story to some degree, emphasizes different elements, adds new details or explanations. The Bell Witch of popular culture is not quite identical to the Bell Witch of the historical record, but both versions coexist and reinforce each other's presence in the collective imagination. In Tennessee, particularly in Robertson County, the Bell Witch serves as a powerful element of regional identity. The legend is taught in local schools, referenced in community events, and celebrated as part of the state's unique folklore. The town of Adams embraces its connection to the story, recognizing both the tourism value and the historical significance. The Bell Witch Cave draws thousands of visitors annually, all seeking some connection to the legend, some experience of the mystery that has endured for 2 centuries. But beneath the commercialization and the entertainment adaptations, the Bell Witch legend continues to raise profound and unsettling questions. What is the nature of reality? Are there forces at work in the world that science cannot yet measure or explain? How do we evaluate testimony and evidence when extraordinary claims are being made? What do we do when credible witnesses report events that seem impossible? These are not trivial questions. They touch on fundamental issues of epistemology, of how we know what we know, and of the limits of materialist explanations for human experience. The Bell Witch also serves as a reminder that folklore is not merely entertainment or superstition. It is one of the ways that communities process traumatic events, preserve collective memory, and transmit cultural values across generations. The story has persisted because it speaks to deep human concerns that transcend any particular time or place. It addresses the vulnerability of families, the mystery of suffering, the fear of the unknown, and the possibility that the world is stranger and more complex than our everyday experience suggests. In the end, the truth of the Bell Witch may matter less than what the story represents. Whether the phenomena were supernatural, psychological, or fraudulent, something happened on the Bell farm between 1817 and 1821 that profoundly affected everyone involved. A family suffered, a man died, a community was shaken, and out of that experience came a story that has survived for 2 centuries, a story that continues to fascinate, to provoke debate, and to resist easy categorization. The Bell Witch is more than just a ghost story. It has become a piece of American mythology, woven into the cultural identity of a region and, to some extent, the nation. It serves as a reminder that mystery has not been eliminated from the world, that there remain stories and experiences that resist complete explanation, and that the boundary between the known and the unknown may be less clearly defined than we sometimes assume in our daily lives. John Bell lies buried on the land where he built his life and where he endured his inexplicable torment. The grave is simple, marked with a modest stone. Visitors can still find it today, can stand on that spot and contemplate the man whose death became legendary. He could not have known that his suffering would be remembered and discussed 2 centuries later, that his name would become forever linked with one of the most famous and perplexing mysteries in American folklore. And what of the Bell Witch herself, if we can call the entity that? Whether she was a spirit, a psychological manifestation, an elaborate deception, or something else entirely, she has achieved her own form of immortality. She exists now in the stories, in the books, in the tourism sites, in the questions that remain unanswered. She is the voice that spoke when no one should have been there, the presence that could not be seen but could not be denied, the mystery at the heart of a story that has never been definitively solved. The tale continues to be told. New generations discover it, debate it, add their own interpretations. The Bell Witch Cave still draws visitors who hope to experience something of the phenomenon for themselves. The legend remains alive in a way that transcends simple belief or disbelief. It has become part of the cultural landscape, a story that endures because it touches something fundamental in the human experience: the encounter with the inexplicable, the confrontation with forces that seem beyond our control or understanding. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the Bell Witch story is not what it tells us about the supernatural, but what it reveals about ourselves. Our need to explain, our willingness to believe, our fear of the unknown, our desire for narratives that make sense of suffering and provide meaning to inexplicable events. The story has survived not because we have proven it true or false, but because we have never been able to do either definitively. It exists in that uncertain space where history and legend intersect, where documented events and folk tradition become impossible to fully separate. The witnesses who came to the Bell Farm in 1817 through 1821 saw something. They heard something. They experienced something that troubled them enough to talk about it for the rest of their lives, to pass the stories down to their children and grandchildren. Whether what they experienced was supernatural, psychological, or the result of elaborate trickery, their testimony forms the foundation of the legend. These were real people, living in a real place, confronting something that defied their understanding of the world. Their confusion, their fear, their attempts to make sense of the inexplicable. These are the authentic core of the story beneath all the layers of later interpretation and embellishment. For the Bell family, the haunting was not a story. It was their lived reality for 4 terrible years. John Bell did not die contemplating his place in folklore. He died in suffering, tormented by forces he could not comprehend or escape. Lucy Bell did not raise her children in the shadow of legend. She raised them in the shadow of genuine terror, doing her best to hold her family together when everything around them seemed to be falling apart. Betsy Bell did not experience a fascinating paranormal phenomenon. She experienced trauma that marked her for life, that shaped her choices and her future in ways she may never have fully understood. The commercialization of their suffering into tourist attractions and entertainment is part of the story too, a later chapter that tells us something about how societies process and commodify tragedy. The Bell Witch Cave, the books, the films, the Halloween attractions, all of these represent the transformation of human pain into cultural product. This transformation is neither entirely good nor entirely bad. It keeps the memory alive. It provides economic benefit to the community. It offers people a way to engage with questions about the nature of reality and the possibility of the supernatural. But it also risks trivializing genuine suffering, turning a family's nightmare into a thrill ride. What remains, after we strip away the tourist attractions and the Hollywood adaptations, after we acknowledge the unknowable gaps in the historical record, after we admit that we cannot definitively prove or disprove the supernatural elements, is a story of human beings confronting something that challenged everything they thought they knew about the world. Whether that something was an actual supernatural entity, a manifestation of psychological distress, or human malice disguised as supernatural phenomena, the confrontation was real. The fear was real. The impact on the people involved was real. The Bell Witch forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about the limits of human knowledge. Science has given us tremendous explanatory power over the natural world, but there remain corners of human experience that resist scientific explanation, not necessarily because they are genuinely supernatural, but because they involve subjective experiences, historical events that left incomplete evidence, and phenomena that occurred before the tools of modern investigation existed. The Bell Witch haunting happened, if it happened as described, before photography, before audio recording, before any of the technologies that allow us to document and analyze unusual events. We have only testimony, and testimony, however sincere and numerous, is always subject to the limitations and biases of human perception and memory. This does not mean the story is false. It means we must hold it with appropriate uncertainty, acknowledging what we know and what we can only speculate about. We know the Bell family existed. We know John Bell died in December of 1820. We know the community was aware of strange events at the Bell farm. We know numerous witnesses reported experiencing phenomena they could not explain. We know the story was being told within the community during and immediately after the events, not just decades later. These facts form the skeleton of the legend, the framework upon which everything else has been built. What we do not know, what we may never be able to know with certainty, is the nature of the phenomena the witnesses experienced. We do not know if the witch's voice was a genuine supernatural manifestation, a case of shared auditory hallucination, or a human voice produced through ventriloquism or hidden speakers. We do not know if the physical phenomena were genuine paranormal activity, the result of psychological forces we do not yet understand, or cleverly staged effects. We do not know if John Bell was poisoned with arsenic by a supernatural entity, by a human murderer who used the haunting as cover, or if he died of natural causes that were interpreted through the lens of the ongoing phenomena. We do not know if Richard Powell was an innocent bystander who happened to benefit from the haunting's outcome, or if he was somehow involved in creating or perpetuating it. These uncertainties are not weaknesses in the story. They are, in fact, what keeps it alive. A mystery that has been definitively solved is no longer a mystery. It becomes simply history, filed away and forgotten. But a mystery that remains unsolved, that continues to generate new theories and new debates, that resists our attempts to explain it away. Such a mystery continues to fascinate generation after generation. The Bell Witch has earned her place in American folklore not because she has been proven real, but because she has never been proven false. The story has survived every attempt to dismiss it, every skeptical investigation, every effort to reduce it to simple psychological or sociological explanations. Something about the case, some combination of credible witnesses, documented events, and phenomena that seem to exceed normal explanation, keeps the possibility alive that we are dealing with something genuinely extraordinary, something that challenges our understanding of what is possible in this world. And so, the legend endures. The Bell Witch continues to haunt not just the land along the Red River in Tennessee, but the American imagination. She has become a symbol of the unexplained, a reminder that for all our scientific progress and rational thinking, there remain corners of existence that we do not fully understand. She represents the possibility, however remote, that the materialist worldview that dominates modern Western thought may not tell the complete story about reality. For some, the Bell Witch is evidence of the supernatural, proof that spirits exist, and that they can interact with the physical world in dramatic and violent ways. For others, she is a cautionary tale about the power of belief, a demonstration of how psychological and social forces can create seemingly supernatural phenomena. For still others, she is simply a great story, a piece of folklore that has been polished and perfected over 2 centuries of retelling. But perhaps she is something else as well. Perhaps the Bell Witch is a mirror, reflecting back to us our own beliefs, our own fears, our own need for mystery in a world that sometimes seems to have explained everything away. What you see when you look into that mirror says as much about you as it does about any historical events in Robertson County 200 years ago. The story asks us to consider what we would do if confronted with phenomena that defied explanation. Would we seek rational answers, as the skeptics who visited the Bell farm did? Would we turn to faith and prayer, as the ministers did? Would we document and observe, as John Bell Jr. did? Or would we simply flee, as some visitors did, unable to face something that challenged our fundamental understanding of reality? These questions are not merely historical or theoretical. They go to the heart of how we navigate a complex world full of things we do not fully understand. The Bell Witch story, stripped of its supernatural trappings, is a story about human beings trying to make sense of the inexplicable, trying to find order in chaos, trying to survive an experience that threatened to overwhelm them. It is a story about the limits of human knowledge and the persistence of mystery in a world that claims to have all the answers. As we stand here, 2 centuries removed from the events on the Bell Farm, we are no closer to a definitive answer than the people who witnessed those events firsthand. We have more information, better tools for analysis, access to historical records, and scientific knowledge that John Bell and his contemporaries could never have imagined. But we still do not know, with absolute certainty, what happened in that house between 1817 and 1821. And perhaps that is exactly as it should be. Perhaps some mysteries are meant to remain mysteries, not because we lack the intelligence or the tools to solve them, but because the mystery itself serves a purpose. It keeps us humble. It reminds us that we do not know everything. It preserves a space in our rational, scientific, modern world for wonder, for possibility, for the acknowledgement that reality may be stranger and more complex than we can fully comprehend. The Bell Witch waits in that space, in the gap between what we know and what we believe, between history and legend, between the documented and the inexplicable. She is the voice in the darkness that should not be there. She is the phenomenon that resists explanation. She is the story that will not die, no matter how many times skeptics try to bury it or believers try to prove it. She is, in the end, a part of American history and American folklore that belongs to all of us, a piece of our collective cultural heritage. The Bell family's suffering has become our story, a narrative that we tell to explore our own beliefs about the nature of reality, the existence of the supernatural, and the limits of human understanding. Whether we believe the witch was real or not, whether we think the phenomena were genuine or manufactured, we are all part of the ongoing life of this legend. John Bell's grave sits quiet now on the land where he lived. The house is gone, the family scattered, the witnesses are all long dead, but the story remains, passed from generation to generation, adapted and reinterpreted but never forgotten. The Bell Witch has outlived everyone who knew the truth of what happened, and in that survival, she has achieved a kind of immortality that transcends any individual life or single historical event. She lives in the stories we tell, in the books we write, in the debates we have about the nature of the supernatural and the limits of the possible. She lives in the cave that bears her name, in the tourists who visit hoping to experience something inexplicable, in the researchers who continue to investigate and theorize about events 200 years past. She lives in the discomfort we feel when we contemplate the possibility that the world might be stranger than we thought, that the boundaries between life and death, between the material and the immaterial, might be more permeable than our modern worldview allows. The Bell Witch is Tennessee's most famous ghost, but she is more than that. She is America's most documented haunting, the most witnessed, the most discussed, the most resistant to easy dismissal or simple explanation. She is the standard against which all other ghost stories are measured, the case that skeptics must grapple with and believers point to as evidence that something beyond the material world exists. And she is waiting still, in the limestone darkness beneath Robertson County, in the pages of history books and folklore collections, in the collective memory of a community and a nation, waiting for the next person who will hear her story and wonder, waiting for the next skeptic who will investigate and leave uncertain, waiting for the next believer who will find in her tale confirmation of what they already knew, waiting in that uncertain space where all the best mysteries live, where questions outnumber answers, and where the only thing we know for certain is that we do not know everything. The Bell Witch haunting ended in 1821, but the Bell Witch herself never really left. She has been with us ever since, a permanent part of the American landscape, a story that refuses to be forgotten or fully explained. She is the witch who killed a man, the spirit who tormented a family, the mystery that has never been solved. She is the voice in the darkness, the presence in the cave, the legend that will not die, and perhaps, in the end, that is the real haunting. Not what happened 200 years ago on a farm in Tennessee, but what continues to happen every time someone hears the story, every time someone wonders if it might be true, every time someone stands at the entrance to the Bell Witch Cave and feels a chill that might be nothing more than the cool air rising from underground, or might be something else entirely. The haunting continues in our uncertainty, in our fascination, in our inability to simply dismiss the story and move on. The Bell Witch lives because we cannot forget her. She lives because the questions she raises are questions we still cannot answer. She lives because somewhere, deep in the human psyche, we need stories like hers. We need mysteries. We need ghosts. We need the possibility that the world is more than what we can see and touch and measure. That there are forces and presences beyond our understanding, that death is not the end, and that the boundary between this world and whatever comes after is thinner and more permeable than we usually allow ourselves to believe. John Bell is gone. Betsy Bell is gone. All the witnesses are gone. The house is gone. But the witch remains, lodged permanently in American folklore, in Tennessee history, in the conversations we have about what is real and what is possible. She has become part of the collective unconscious, a symbol and a story that means different things to different people, but that speaks to something fundamental in all of us. The tale of the Bell Witch is not finished. It will never be finished. As long as people gather to tell stories, as long as we wonder about the nature of reality and the possibility of the supernatural, as long as we seek to understand events that challenge our worldview, the Bell Witch will be there. She will be in the darkness at the edge of the campfire light. She will be in the skeptical doubt that cannot quite dismiss the possibility. She will be in the believer's certainty that there is more to existence than the material world. She is waiting in Robertson County, Tennessee, in a cave beneath the earth, in the soil where John Bell lies buried, in the collective memory of a community and a nation. She is waiting in the space between belief and disbelief, between history and legend, between what we know and what we only imagine. She is waiting for you, for anyone who will listen to her story, who will wrestle with the questions she raises, who will stand at the edge of the mystery and look into the darkness and wonder what might be looking back. The Bell Witch, America's greatest ghost story, Tennessee's most famous haunting, a legend 2 centuries old that shows no signs of fading, a mystery that has never been solved and perhaps never will be, a story of suffering transformed into folklore, of tragedy turned into legend, of one family's nightmare becoming part of the collective dream of a nation. She spoke once, this witch, in a voice that hundreds heard but no one could explain. She tormented and attacked and killed, or so the story goes. And then she fell silent, retreating into the cave, into the earth, into legend. But her silence is not absence, it is waiting. It is the pause between one chapter and the next. It is the breath before the story begins again. And it always begins again. With each new generation that discovers the tale, with each visitor who descends into the cave hoping to experience something inexplicable, with each researcher who reads the old accounts and tries once more to solve the unsolvable, with each skeptic who investigates and leaves uncertain, with each believer who finds confirmation, with each person who stands on that land and feels something they cannot quite name, something that might be imagination or might be memory or might be something else entirely, the Bell Witch endures. Not because we have proven she was real, but because we have never been able to prove she was not. Not because we understand what happened, but because we do not. Not in spite of the mystery, but because of it. She is the unknown at the heart of the known world. She is the question that has no answer. She is the story that will never end. And in the darkness of the cave, in the quiet of the Tennessee night, in the space between one telling and the next, she waits. She has always been waiting. She will always be waiting. For the next person who will wonder, for the next person who will doubt, for the next person who will believe, for the next person who will try to explain her away and fail. The Bell Witch, still haunting, still waiting, still refusing to be explained or dismissed or forgotten, Still the greatest ghost story America has ever produced. Still the mystery at the heart of the legend. Still the voice in the darkness that should not be there but is. Always has been. Always will be.